Hi everyone. I recall standing on the porch of our new home watching the moving truck pull away. It was a clear, cool fall morning with crunchy leaves beneath your feet. I should have been thrilled about this new chapter, this new marriage, this new home, and this new beginning with Greg, but as I looked up at the window upstairs, where Michael was standing and watching me, I felt a pang of uncertainty. Perhaps it wasn't the wide-eyed curiosity of a boy meeting his new stepmother, but rather fatigue. Michael was 18 years old, practically an adult, and set in his ways. He had been the head of the household during the unpleasant divorce between Greg and his ex-wife, and now he was expected to accept me as a part of his life without any say in the matter. Greg had warned me about this, telling me how difficult it had been for Michael and how he had locked himself in his room for hours playing video games or listening to music during the divorce. Needed time, but I didn't want to be just another person in his life who left him feeling forgotten or abandoned. Instead, I wanted to be someone he could trust, someone he could rely on, but whenever we were alone together, I could sense the tension because the silence was heavy with everything we weren't saying. Greg, oblivious in his own way, seemed to think that time would solve everything. He was content to work hard and trust that the pieces of his new life would naturally fit together, but he wasn't the one here with Michael every single day. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I noticed Michael was quieter than usual. He had come home from school and slumped onto the couch, his shoulders hunched and his expression distant. I kept looking over at him, hoping for some sign that he was okay, but he just sat there staring at the TV without really watching it. I called him, gently wiping my hands on a dish towel as I walked over to him. He didn't immediately respond, just nodded. I sat down on the couch's arm and hesitated for a moment before answering. "You seem off tonight. Is everything okay?" He shrugged, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Yeah, I'm fine," he muttered, the same response he always gave, but tonight it felt different. There was a rawness in his voice, a heaviness that made me pause. I knew I should leave it alone and give him space, but something inside of me pushed forward. "Are you sure?" I asked gently. "You don't look fine." I could see him struggling with himself, trying to decide whether or not to let me in. The air between us felt heavy with unspoken words that we'd both been avoiding since I moved in. Then, with a deep sigh, he nodded toward the stairs. "It's just never mind," he said, shaking his head as if he was brushing off a thought he didn't want to share. "No, tell me." I urged him, "Please, I want to help if I can." I pushed it away and gave him a small, comforting smile. "Of course," I said, "let him go," and we went upstairs together. The sound of our footsteps reverberated throughout the quiet house, and my bedroom felt cozy and secure thanks to the bedside lamp's gentle glow. I sat down on the edge of the bed, and he stood there awkwardly for a while before finally sitting next to me. He kept his head down and fidgeting with his hands in his lap, as if he was unsure of what to do with them. I waited, giving him the time he needed. He finally said, in a low, strained voice, "I just feel out of place, like I don't fit here anymore." The sadness in his voice made me want to reach out and give him a hug, but I wasn't sure if that was the right thing to do. Instead, I nodded, keeping my face open and gentle. "I understand that," I said softly. "I can't imagine how hard this must be for you." He said, "You don't have to say that. I know I'm just being difficult." I firmly stated, "This is your home, Michael, and I know it's not perfect right now, but I'm here. I'm trying to make it better for you." He finally looked at me, and I felt the weight of his gaze. It wasn't the look of a boy to his stepmother. Rather, it was deeper and filled with something unspoken that I wasn't ready to face. "I just feel lost." He admitted that his voice was breaking a little, but I couldn't help it. I reached over and put my hand there. "Everything has changed since Dad remarried." He leaned into my touch just a little, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. It felt like a breakthrough, a tiny crack in the wall he built between us. For a brief moment, we sat in silence, the air between us charged with something I couldn't quite define, comforting but also unsettling, like standing too close to a fire. He pulled away first, standing up and running a hand through his hair, looking at me. I put a gentle squeeze on his shoulder and said, "You're not alone." He muttered, "I should probably go to bed," and I nodded while trying to maintain my composure. "Yeah, it's late," I said. "Good night, Michael." He stopped at the door and gave me a look that I couldn't read before slipping out of the room. When the door clicked shut behind him, I let out a breath, not realizing that I had been holding my hand, which still tingled where I touched his shoulder, and I pressed it to my chest, feeling my heart thump quickly. A brief moment of connection, but it felt more like the start of a new chapter that I wasn't sure I was ready to write. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling and mentally reliving our conversation, telling myself it was only a small step toward improving our relationship and that I was doing the right thing, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had changed between us, something I wasn't even ready to acknowledge to myself, and in that silent darkness, I realized for the first time that it felt like we had turned a corner after that night in my room. The awkward tension between Michael and I had subsided and been replaced by something warmer and more familiar. I wasn't sure when it started to change, but we found ourselves spending more time together almost without realizing it. It was as if we both needed this connection, which felt different from what either of us had expected. The lines I thought were clear might be more blurred than I ever imagined. The days seemed to blend together. Michael entered the kitchen while I was preparing pancakes, and he was still wiping the sleep from his eyes. "Smells good," he muttered as he leaned against the counter and watched me flip the pancakes. "Your dad used to love these," I said, putting more batter on the griddle. I noticed a hint of nostalgia or an unmistakable sadness in his face as he picked up a plate and began setting the table without my asking. It was a small gesture, but it made my heart a little. Together, we shared the easy silence of a weekend morning, which felt like the start of a new routine. Soon after, it became a habit, and we would frequently find ourselves in the kitchen together, making a mess of flowers and laughing while cooking dinner or baking cookies. Michael's protective facade gradually began to crumble, and I caught glimpses of the boy underneath. The one who enjoyed corny action movies, had a wicked sense of humor, and could talk passionately about cars for hours if you let him. Michael was on the couch scrolling through Netflix after a long day at work. He looked up when I walked in, and before I could say anything, he patted the cushion next to him and asked, almost shyly, if I wanted to watch something. I hesitated for a second before I sat down next to him, and it felt strangely intimate. We ended up watching a ridiculous action movie together, with a bowl of popcorn balanced on his lap. We laughed at the ridiculous stunts and awful dialogue, and at one point I looked over and realized It was just a movie night, just two people bonding, I told myself, and it was harmless. A few weeks later, walks in the park began, which was Michael's idea. Surprisingly, he had been quiet all afternoon more than usual, and I could tell something was bothering him. He looked away quickly when our eyes met, a faint blush creeping up his neck. I pretended not to notice, turning my attention back to the movie, but I couldn't get rid of the fluttering feeling in my chest. The park was lovely in the late afternoon light, with the trees ablaze with autumn colors. We walked side by side, our footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. It felt peaceful, almost like a respite from everything else. At first, we didn't talk much, just enjoyed the silence and the sound of the wind rustling through the branches. Then, slowly, Michael began to open up, telling me little things about his favorite childhood memories and the trips he used to take with. Before everything went wrong, I listened and nodded, letting him steer the conversation in any direction he wanted. I could tell he needed someone to listen to him without passing judgment or putting pressure on him. I told him about 2 amusing incidents from my own childhood and the foolish things I had done before I met Greg. He laughed at my tells, and it felt good to know that we were establishing a strong bond one little story at a time. One evening, after another marathon of movies, we ended up sitting on the couch long after the credits had rolled. The room was dimly lit, with only the TV screen providing a gentle glow. Michael was quieter than usual, his face half-shadowed, and he was lost in thought. I asked him, gently nudging his knee with mine. He took a deep breath and ran a hand through his hair, saying it's stupid, while looking down at his hands. "Hey," I said, placing a hand on his arm. "If it's being you, it's not stupid, tell me." He looked up, and the vulnerability in his eyes struck me like a kick to the gut. "I keep thinking," he began, his voice low. His words hung in the air so heavy and heartbreaking that I felt a wave of sympathy so strong it nearly made me dizzy. Without thinking, I reached for him and put my arm around his shoulders, drawing him close. He didn't resist leaning into me as if he'd been holding this weight for too long. "Oh, Michael," I whispered, gently stroking his hair. "No, it was never your fault the decisions your parents made where there's alone you." He was silent for a moment, his head resting against my shoulder. I could feel the warmth of his body against mine, the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. It was such a simple, innocent moment, but it felt profound, like we were sharing something deeper than words could express. When he finally pulled back, he looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. Our faces were inches apart, and I could see the tears glistening in his eyes. "You didn't do anything wrong, child." His voice was rough with unspoken pain, but he managed to hold back when he said, "Thank you." I nodded, my hand still resting on his shoulder, my thumb absently stroking the soft fabric of his shirt. "I'll always be here for you," he said, meaning every word. The silence between us was thick with something I didn't want to name, and we were just staring at each other, neither of us moving as if we were frozen in that moment. There was a slight change in the air the slightest movement, only a fraction of an inch, but it felt like everything was tilting, as if the ground beneath us was shifting. I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the way his breath caught, and I knew mine did the same. It wasn't a kiss, not quite, but it was something close. The space between us felt charged, humming with an electricity I hadn't felt in years. We didn't speak. We just sat there holding on to each other. When we finally pulled apart, it was slow and reluctant. He gave me a small, uncertain smile, and I managed to smile back, even though my heart was racing in my chest. "Good night," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Good night," I replied, watching as he got up and left, leaving me alone on the couch. We were both trying to make sense of what had just happened, as well as the new, fragile bond that was forming between us. That night on the couch, something changed between us. It wasn't anything we talked about. There were no whispered conversations, no confessions. It was just a silent moment. I told myself it was just a moment of vulnerability, a blip in our new relationship, but deep down I knew it was more than that. Once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. I spent a long time there after he left, staring at the dark TV screen, trying to piece together what had just happened. I half expected Michael to act differently the following morning, retreating into his usual silence or pulling away, but he gave me a small sleepy smile when he came down for breakfast. Everything felt oddly normal, with him sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through his phone while I made coffee, the steam curling up into the morning light. This was an unspoken change in the air that neither of us acknowledged out loud, but it was there lingering between us like a shared secret. As the days passed, I noticed subtle but noticeable changes in our interactions. He began spending more time downstairs sitting with me in the living room while I watched TV or read a book, and his eyes softened slightly when our gazes met. Although we didn't discuss that moment on the couch, perhaps that was for the best because it was easier to pretend that it was a brief moment of vulnerability that didn't mean anything more. Sometimes he would rest his head on my shoulder while we watched movies, and I would feel his hair brushing against my cheek. It felt innocent, almost comforting, but there was a part of me that knew it was more than that. There was a warmth in those small touches, a kind of intimacy I hadn't anticipated. One night, while we were watching an old black and white movie, Michael's hand slipped into mine while neither of us was really paying attention. I looked over at him expecting to see a smirk or a playful grin, but he had his eyes closed and his head resting against the back of the couch. He looked so calm, almost childlike, and for a moment I let myself enjoy the closeness and quiet, but as the movie came to an end and the credits rolled, I carefully withdrew my hand, feeling a rush of guilt mixed with something I didn't want to name. Michael opened his eyes and gave me a drowsy smile, and I managed to smile back despite my heart thumping in my chest. "Good night," I said softly as I stood up and smoothed down my clothes to cover up the tremble in my hands. He replied in a warm, low voice that seemed to be meant just for me. I went upstairs, but I had trouble falling asleep because I kept thinking about how his hand felt in mine, how his skin felt soft, and how it made me feel safe and wanted. I knew it wasn't right, but I couldn't deny how much I needed that feeling. The weeks that followed were a blur of moments spent together, little hints of something deeper that neither of us dared to discuss. We continued to walk together, sometimes talking, sometimes just walking silently, and Michael began to open up to me more about his anxieties, fears, and uncertainties about the future, including his mother and their tense relationship, and how he felt he would never be able to live up to her expectations. I listened, nodding, and tried to offer consoling words when I could. He was so different from the boy I'd first met, a boy who hardly looked at me and kept his feelings deep inside, but I couldn't help but be drawn to him because of the raw honesty in his voice. He was opening up and sharing parts of himself that I knew he didn't share with anyone else, which made me feel special, like I was the only person he trusted and could rely on. One evening, as we sat together in the living room with the sun casting long shadows across the room, with a serious expression on his face, Michael turned to face me. "Can I ask you something?" he asked in a quiet, almost hesitant voice. "Of course," I said, my heart pounding. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong?" His eyes dropped to his hands, as if he were trying so hard to fit into this perfect little box. "But no matter what you do, you just can't." I was momentarily silent, taken aback by the unadulterated vulnerability in his voice. "Yes," I said softly, reaching out to put a hand on his knee. "I keep thinking that maybe if I had been better, if I hadn't caused so much trouble, they would still be together." "Oh, Michael," I whispered, feeling a rush of sympathy so strong it nearly took my breath away. His eyes searched mine, and I saw the unspoken plea there, the need for reassurance, for comfort. "Sometimes I wonder if it's my fault that he admitted the divorce." "Never your fault," I whispered, gently stroking his hair. "The decisions your parents made had nothing to do with you. You were just a child, and you did the best you could." He buried his face in my shoulder, trembling slightly as he breathed shakily. I could feel the tears seeping into my shirt, so I held him closer, rocking him gently, as if he were a small child. "I'm so glad you're here," he said, his voice muffled against my skin. "I don't know what I'd do without you. I'm here." I could feel his heartbeat against mine, the steady rhythm grounding me and making me feel more alive than I had in years. Eventually, he pulled back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He gave me a small, shy smile, and I felt my heart swell with a fierce protectiveness. I wanted to keep him safe. No matter where we stayed for what felt like an eternity wrapped up in each other, the rest of the world falling away. It was such a simple moment, just two people offering comfort, but it felt profound, like something had clicked into place. We didn't discuss what had happened that night, but there was a quiet undercurrent that pervaded everything we did. When we sat together on the couch, our hands would find each other's fingers lacing together, like it was the most natural thing in the world. As a result, our moments together felt different. There was a deeper trust between us, a sense of shared secrets, and an unspoken understanding. When we hugged, it lasted a little longer than it should have. It wasn't easy. There were times when I felt the pull between us and wanted to lean in a little closer to press my lips to his forehead or his cheek, but I restrained myself. We both knew where the line was, and we didn't cross it. We learned how to navigate this new dynamic by learning how to balance the closeness with the boundaries we needed to maintain. I was focused on being there for him, offering support without going too far, and he learned to trust me in a way he hadn't before. It wasn't the kind of love I had anticipated finding, but it was love nonetheless, based on trust, shared stories, quiet moments, and a bond that transcended the typical definitions of family. Perhaps that was enough. The months passed in a quiet rhythm, with each day blending into the next, but there was a subtle harmony that hadn't existed before. The house felt cozier and more lived in, as if Michael Gregg and I had finally found our calling. Michael's transformation was the most impressive of all. He had gone from being closed off and distant to being more open and at ease. He still had his quiet moments when he would retreat to his room, but they were becoming fewer and farther between. We had created a space for ourselves, a small sanctuary of sorts, based on shared stories and the kind of connection that didn't require words. I watched him become more self-assured and his laughter coming. One evening, as winter started to melt into spring, we found ourselves sitting on the back porch, wrapped in blankets against the lingering chill. The sky was a deep dusky blue, and the first stars were just starting to peek through. Michael leaned back against the railing, his face tilted up toward the sky. His smiles were less guarded, and he began inviting friends over, filling the house with the sound of teenage voices and loud music. It was a beautiful chaos, a reminder of what it meant to have a family, even if it was unconventional. The sky's small, contented smile playing on his lips. "It's nice out here," he said, quietly breaking the comfortable silence. "It is," I agreed, taking a sip of my tea. "I can't wait until it's warm enough to plant the garden again." He nodded, glancing over at me with a soft expression. "I'll help this year," he said. "If you want, I'd like that," I said, smiling. It was a simple offer, but it meant more than he probably realized. It felt like a promise, a commitment to be a part of this family we were building. Together, he shifted closer, draping his blanket around his shoulders and pulling it tighter against the cold. I noticed how he sat a little nearer than before, how the space between us seemed to shrink with each passing day. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. There was a closeness now that we hadn't had in the beginning, a sense of trust that had taken root and grown stronger with time. "I was thinking," he said after a while, his voice hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he should say it out loud, "about everything that's happened, about you and me, and how things have changed." I turned to look at him, giving him my full attention. "What about it?" He took a deep breath, fiddling with the edge of the blanket. I wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for everything, for being there for me when I needed it, for listening. I don't know if I would have made it through this year without you." His words hit me harder than I expected, filling my chest with a warmth that spread all the way to my fingertips. I reached out, placing a hand on his arm, squeezing gently. "You don't." "Thank you, Michael," I said quietly. "I'm just glad I could be there for you." He swallowed hard, as if he was trying to control his emotions. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with something he couldn't quite hide. There was a long pause, the kind of comfortable silence that we'd gotten so good at sharing. The stars were brighter now, casting a soft silvery glow over the porch. Michael turned to me, his eyes shining with a sincerity that left me speechless. "I'm glad," I whispered. "That's all I ever wanted." He leaned over and gave me a hug that felt different from the others, not the clinging, desperate embrace of someone who needed comfort, but the hug of someone who had found it. "You've made this place feel like home again," he said quietly. "It hadn't felt that way for a long time, not after the divorce, but now it feels like I belong here." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, and I blinked them back, giving him a watery smile. He said, "I'm really glad you're here," in a light but meaningful voice, and I replied, "We didn't need to say anything else." I buried my face in his hair, inhaled the familiar scent of his shampoo, and felt the warmth of his body grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. When we finally pulled back, we just sat there side by side, brushing our shoulders. He gave me a small, crooked smile, and I returned it, feeling a peace settle over me that I hadn't realized I was looking for. Labels of stepmother and stepson, but it was something more profound, based on respect and understanding for one another. It was the kind of love that defied easy classification, but that didn't make it any less genuine. As we sat there side by side, watching the night sky in silence, it felt for the first time like everything had come together, as if the ragged fragments of our lives had finally come together and made sense. As we sat there, I realized that this was home, not the house, not the... I reached over and took his hand in mine, and he gently squeezed it, giving me a look that said everything he didn't need to say aloud. We smiled at each other, a shared understanding passing between us, and for the first time, I felt completely at peace in that moment, sitting together under the stars, knowing that we'd both found what we were looking for: home. Marriage, but this connection, this quiet, unspoken bond between us, was the family we created, imperfect and messy,